Well, this goes back to what we've wanted to talk about, which was the Fairness Doctrine, which, by the way, in 1949, the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, created the policy of the Fairness Doctrine, and it said that TV and radio stations had to get a license from the government, which like it still has to do, and it had to do two things. First, they had to spend some of their airtime discussing important political issues that the public needed to know about, either locally, nationally, or a combination of the two. And second, when they did, they had to present different sides of the issues fairly or presented in a factual manner that had no sides. And this did not mean giving each side the exact same amount of time, but it did mean making sure contrasting viewpoints were heard, as the FCC's goal was to make sure the public was exposed to a variety of opinions. And this policy change in 1949 was actually a change to an older rule called the Mayflower Doctrine. That earlier rule had banned stations from giving their own opinions or supporting political candidates on the air.
Yes, now they could give their opinions. Now they could give their opinions, but they still had to present both sides of an issue. And so, for reference, this is different. This is different than the rule, the equal time rule with the political candidates. That's still in place today. That's different.
Well, I was about to say
that only deals with candidates themselves. It doesn't actually deal with any issues. The Fairness Doctrine dealt with actual political issues regardless of candidates. So it was much more broad and it applied to much more things.
Yes, and it was a general guideline. For example, the first presidential debate to be under the Fairness Doctrine as official FCC regulations was in 1967, as the policy was used by the presidential administrations of John F. Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson, and Richard Nixon to go after their political opponents on talk, radio, and TV. Which is, I think, interesting. But something happened in 1969, which was the first legal case, Red Lion Broadcasting Company versus the FCC. It started when a journalist named Fred J. Cook wanted free airtime to respond to personal attacks made against him on a radio station in Pennsylvania. That case went all the way to SCOTUS, the Supreme Court of the United States, and it was a ruling of 8-0 in favor of the FCC, saying that the Fairness Doctrine was constitutional. The court's reasoning was that airwaves are a limited public resource, so the government could require broadcasters to share them and present different views. The court said the most important right was that of the viewer and listener to be informed, and not the right of the broadcasters. However, the court also warned that if the policy ever ended up reducing free speech instead of encouraging it, its constitutionality would need to be looked at again.
And that is an interesting thing that you bring up, because this kind of segues into a point that I want to make about bringing the Fairness Doctrine back. So the Fairness Doctrine obviously hasn't existed since the Reagan administration decided they wanted to stop enforcing it back in the 80s. I don't remember the exact year. But the Fairness Doctrine, it's never been deemed unconstitutional. The rule does. I think the rule got pulled from the Federal Register like years later.
You want me to finish? I can get us to. If you want me to finish, tell you. Yeah. Okay. So I'll get to you right to the end, and then you can go on your rant, and then I'll give the rest of the information I researched. So in 1974, the FCC noted that Congress had given it the power to enforce the Fairness Doctrine. The FCC said it wasn't strictly enforcing it at the time because broadcasters were following the spirit of the rule on their own, but the FCC warned it would step in if that changed. In the 1980s, legal challenges and a changing media landscape put the Fairness Doctrine under pressure. In 1985, the FCC, led by Chairman Mark Fowler, appointed by yours truly, President Ronald Reagan, issued a report saying the Fairness Doctrine actually hurt the public interest and violated broadcasters' free speech rights. The FCC wasn't sure if Congress had officially made the doctrine a law. And in 1986, in a case about new technology called teletext, two important judges on federal appeals court, Robert Bork and Antonin Scalia
and Robert Bork. Those are two very influential conservative judges from that time period.
Okay, so they ruled that
Scalia would later be on the Supreme Court for 30 years.
did not. Oh my God, I didn't realize the same Celia.
Yep, same guy.
And they ruled that the FCC wasn't required to apply the Fairness Doctrine to it. In 1987, in the case of Meredith Corporation versus the FCC, the same court said Congress had not mandated the doctrine, and the FCC didn't have to enforce it anymore. Later that year, on August 4th, 1987, the FCC, now led at the time by Chairman Dennis R. Patrick, officially voted 4-0 to abolish the Fairness Doctrine in the Syracuse Peace Council decision. The FCC stated that enforcing the doctrine actually made broadcasters less likely to cover controversial issues, which hurts the public. Chairman Patrick said that they wanted to give electronic media the same First Amendment freedoms as newspapers. This decision was very unpopular with many in Congress. They tried to pass a law in June 1987 to make the Fairness Doctrine a permanent law, but President Ronald Reagan vetoed it. A similar attempt in 1991 was stopped when President George H.W. Bush threatened to veto. The end of the Fairness Doctrine in 1987 is often credited with allowing the rise of modern talk radio and TV, like the nationally syndicated show of Rush Limbaugh, which started in 1988. Before the doctrine was repealed, stations had to be much more careful about airing one-sided arguments. And two smaller rules related to the doctrine stayed in place for a while, which was, one was called the, quote, personal attack rule, end quote, and the other was the, quote, political editorial rule, end quote. In October 2000, the FCC repealed those rules too, after a court asked the FCC to justify them, and the FCC failed to do so quickly. So we'll talk about attempts to bring back the Fairness Doctrine. I want to hear what you were going to say.
So, with this whole idea of bringing back the Fairness Doctrine, that case, Red Lion, like you mentioned earlier, talked about how it could be unconstitutional if, instead of supporting free speech, it hindered free speech. That was the rationale that the Supreme Court said could happen. I think if the Fairness Doctrine was ever to be brought back today, it would be declared unconstitutional. It would probably get appealed to the Supreme Court and be declared unconstitutional. It would face challenges at the very least in the lower courts. I have no way of knowing how those would rule because I don't know what lower courts they're going to bring them in. But if it gets to the Supreme Court, which it presumably would, it would most definitely be this Supreme Court, the current makeup of the Supreme Court, would most definitely declare it unconstitutional. I 100% believe that. So, I don't even know. And I personally would argue that it is. I'm satisfied with the reasoning from the court, and that was unanimous in Red Lion. But I think this Supreme Court would not be, and I think the Supreme Court would argue that making sure that they provide equal coverage for both sides of a controversial issue would restrict free speech. I would argue that's what they're going to say. So I think that any thoughts that anybody has of trying to reinstate the Fairness Doctrine is kind of just throwing something at the wall and hoping it sticks, because I think even if somebody were to try to enforce it, which I don't think any president ever even would, even if a president's FCC tried, it probably gets declared unconstitutional. That the court is just, the makeup of the courts are just significantly different now than they were even in the 1980s when the Fairness Doctrine was initially they initially stopped enforcing it.
Yeah, I think I've told you this, and this is I'll delve into it more in the end of this episode. But what I personally think is, I think it is Julia Louis-Dreyfus, who her father was a broadcaster himself, and this is where I came up with this idea. And I want to confirm that this is yes. So was it Julia Louis-Dreyfus? Or it might have been somebody else. Either way, the moral of the story is that there was a celebrity whose parent was a journalist. And the reason why I found that interesting was, where did he get educated? It said that he had gotten educated at, I think it was the Baltimore Public Radio Broadcasting Trade School, something along those lines. And I started looking, and this was in the 1920s and 30s. Colleges used to just offer STEM degrees. You went to college to either become a teacher, or you went to math, science, engineering. And if you wanted to go into a different profession, you went to trade school. And that's a lot of the most famous journalists from the 20th century didn't go to college. They went to a trade school to learn how to be a radio broadcaster or to be a public broadcaster. And I personally have told you this. I think, like a real estate agent, you should have at least a high school diploma, and you need to be required to take a course and then take an exam that gives you a license. And then I think real estate agents just have to keep their license active by either doing, I think, similar to like lawyers, like continuing their education or doing certain thresholds to meet so they don't have to either retake the test or just retake the test. And I feel like that might honestly be the best way to go about it, because that way the FCC is able to dictate more, I guess, not like saying that they need to hold, but like if you're saying you are the news, the FCC should be able to tell you can't say you're the news like Fox News. You can't have Fox News in your name if you're admitting in a court case that you guys are an entertainment company. You guys can't report the news. You can't say you're reporting.
It's just very interesting. It's very interesting to see how that, if that's even constitutional, requiring people to get licenses to be a journalist. Again, I'm not.
Oh, why do I need a license to sell a house?
I agree with you. I think it would serve the public good better. I just think that the way that courts would interpret freedom of speech would go against that. I think that courts would be very hesitant to make it so journalists have to pass an exam and get a license to do reporting, because that kind of goes a whole against. At least they would argue. I'm assuming it goes against the whole freedom of speech or freedom of the press, First Amendment thing, right? So it's like you have to. It's just hard to envision a world where that actually even is possible, just because I think public opinion would be low, even though I think it's better for the public. I think the public is stupid, and the public opinion would be low, and it'd be subject to numerous challenges and probably get declared unconstitutional. I just think like this country is just so it lends too far into the protecting speech. Like I think we've gone too far with freedom of speech, because like we've made it very clear that we protect misinformation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And hate speech, which I would argue we shouldn't do. I think it'd be better for the public if we didn't, but we do. This is America. That's what we do. And I think that some similar First Amendment arguments relating to freedom of the press would probably be approved by courts in this country, that any licensure, any subject exam, any state registry for journalists would be a no-no. That's my gut feeling.
I think and this is, look, I think one of the interesting things in Europe, the equivalent to the Fairness Doctrine, is that they require broadcasters to cover controversial issues in a balanced manner. That obviously there's certain regulations by certain countries, like for example, BBC or the RAD are the biggest news services in those countries, as that's where you go to get your news. We don't have that. Like the NPR should be the number one place everybody goes to see the news, just the news, like the BBC is and the ARD is in Germany. While I also believe that we should have liable hate speech laws that may, obviously, depending on what it is. I mean, we do have hate crime speech, or like certain hate speech that is actually prosecutable here, but it's different. I think similar to how Bridget Bardot was like 10 times convicted for being for hate speech,
yes,
where they had to fine her. And basically what it is when you go to a job, your job will see that you repeatedly have been founded guilty in a petty offense or whatever you want to call it for hate speech, and what that specific hate speech is that you are so willing to spew. And I think, with that being said, if those laws were enacted, then people would be able to sue news stations way easier, and then those corporations will naturally be self-imposing a fairness doctrine, because they're going to with the ability that if we had laws like Europe where you could be liable for hate speech, then people would be able to have an easier time suing the news. And then I know somebody's going to be like, from a business, like, why would we want corporations to be easier sued? Because then they would self-impose the Fairness Doctrine to themselves, because they know they can't have their journalists being pundits and just spewing whatever reactionary garbage that they want to say that is going to get the clicks, and instead just provide them with the news, because it will disincentivize the need to create salacious headlines and reactionary takes.
Yes, and like we said many times before, like I've said before, I agree with you. I think the public interest would be better served if we had, to some extent, European free speech laws. To some extent, like, I don't think it's a good idea that they have locked up college kids for protesting, their country's giving money to the IDF. Like, that's bad. And I'm glad in America, I mean, even then in America, that still happens and we have freedom of speech. People still get arrested for that anyway. So you know what? Maybe I take that back, what I said. Maybe we aren't that different. But I do think the public interest would definitely be better served by strictly enforcing fairness in our news, strictly holding our news and our journalists to higher standards, so they can't just be like that Nick Shirley guy. But in America, with our current framework of laws, I just don't see any possibility. I don't see any of our solutions to make our country more like Europe, speech-wise and hate speech-wise and media-wise. We just have too many protections. We have too many protections for bad faith actors in this country.
Yeah, well,
it's a really big problem that we have.
So there's this thing called the Digital Service Act in Europe that is literally enforced by the European Commission, as the United States and the European Union's regulation of online platforms are drastically different. The U.S. administration currently criticizes EU for, quote, limiting free speech, end quote, and called the EU's content moderation laws as incompatible with American free speech tradition. But that, I think, is a lot based on misconceptions and misunderstandings. Obviously, in America, the First Amendment of the United States provides almost absolute protection to freedom of expression. By contrast, European and EU law curtails the right of freedom of expression. Article 10 of the European Convention of Human Rights, which applies to all EU member states, states that freedom of expression carries with it the duties and responsibilities. In a democratic society, restrictions may be imposed in the interest, among others, of national security, territorial integrity, or public safety, for the prevention of disorder or crime, for the protection of health or morals, for the protection of reputation or rights of others. EU legislation criminalizes hate speech that publicly incites violence or hatred and targets a set of protected characteristics like race, color, religion, descent, or natural or ethnic origin. Even though legislation in EU member states varies widely, some might have extended protection from hate speech or additional characteristics. But with all that being said, the focus has been whether or not, like, what Europe does would be allowed. And I think the United States has opted to not to impose any obligation on social media or news to remove content that's created by third parties, merely granting them the right to restrict access to certain material deemed obscene or otherwise objectionable. The EU, in contrast, has adopted regulation that obliges companies to remove offensive content created by third parties, including hate speech, once it's brought to their attention. And that is going back to what I was saying, is that if you're enacting that, if something is brought to your attention and you can't ignore it, then I think that still allows for the grounds of, like, being able to enact, I guess, some sort of European approach to regulating the news, similar to how they have been able to.
It's just like, I think a creative solution would have to be to regulate it indirectly. So, like, for example, completely different scenario, but I'm gonna use this as an analogy just for the sake of analogies. Do you remember when they tried to make the drinking age 21 instead of 18 back in the day? And how they did? Do you remember how they did it? The measure that they did it? they couldn't just force states to raise the drinking age. That would have been unconstitutional. They couldn't say, you guys must raise your drinking age to the national one. But they could withhold highway funding from the states. And the Supreme Court allowed them to do that. They said that they could. So it would have to be something like that, where it would be like an indirect regulation of news companies. Like, maybe not explicitly take away their licenses, but like
find them.
Yeah, I was about to say.
That's what I was gonna say. Don't. Taking the license away is the last thing.
We can't take away their license because we can't go right for that because that's pretty restrictive. But what we could do is impose fines until they're bankrupt. You guys aren't following our You guys aren't following FCC regulations, and we have the authority to do this. And because we have that's a much stronger argument to hold up in court. Is we're just an agency trying to enforce our regulations, and they're not complying.
Yes,
because we can't. Because we would have to regulate something like that. We'd have to regulate them indirectly instead of just threatening to take them off the air. It would have to be fines for not complying with some other FCC rule. Which maybe we could do that. Obviously, that's a little murky, and nobody really knows how legal it is or not until we would get it in front of a judge. But that would because of our constitutional protections for free press and free speech, and the fact that we have so much protections for people to just spread bigoted shit and lie. We would have to come up with something that we could argue doesn't exceed agency authority and doesn't violate the First Amendment. And I think like indirectly regulating them through fines might be a good solution, but it's just like a lot of the easier solutions like Europe, we can't do.
Yeah. So let's talk real quickly before we get back to some creative solutions. What has happened since? So after 1987, there had been many attempts to bring the Fairness Doctrine back. Supporters, often Democrats, argue it promotes balanced debate and is needed to counter one-side talk radios or just partisan interest on the news outlets. For example, in 2005, Representative Louise Slaughter and Maurice Hinchey introduced bills to restore it. In 2007, then Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, said she supported it. In 2009, Senator Tom Harkin and former President Bill Clinton also expressed support. Most recently, in 2019, former Representative Tulsi Gabbard introduced a bill called, quote, Restore the Fairness Doctrine Act of 2019, end quote, but it didn't pass.
Wow, that's funny. How things change, huh?
How things change, yeah. Opponents, mostly conservatives and libertarians, strongly fight these attempts. They see the doctrine as an attack on free speech and property rights. In 2007, Senators Norm Pullman and John Thune proposed the Broadcasters Freedom Act to permanently block the FCC from ever reinstating the Fairness Act doctrine. The same year, Representatives Mike Pence introduced a similar bill in the House. Republican Senator Jim DeMint also led efforts to guarantee the doctrine would not come back. In 2008, then Senator Barack Obama's campaign made it clear he did not support reimposing the Fairness Doctrine, a position his White House reaffirmed in 2009, which is kind of weird to think of. And in February 2009, the Senate voted 87-11 to add the Broadcasters Freedom Act as an amendment to another bill, showing strong opposition to reviving the doctrine. The same year, a poll found that 47% of likely voters supported a government requirement for equal liberal and conservative commentary on TV and radio, while 39% opposed it. Finally, in August 2011, following an executive order from President Obama to eliminate outdated regulations, the FCC formally removed the Fairness Doctrine rule from the official federal regulations. Now, trying to bring back the original Fairness Doctrine exactly as it existed from 1949 to 1987 is highly unlikely and would be very difficult. Like you said, if they did it, the FCC got rid of the doctrine in the first place because the agency decided it violated free speech rights of the broadcasters. The FCC found that the rule didn't encourage their different viewpoints, and instead it chilled speech, which you could debate if that was true or not. If the FCC or Congress tried to bring it back, they would almost certainly face huge legal challenges in court that would lead to the Supreme Court that, as you mentioned earlier, would probably be deemed unconstitutional because of the First Amendment. The old Fairness Doctrine only ever applied to broadcast radio and TV stations that used public airways. The legal reason the government could regulate them was spectrum scarcity. There was only a limited number of broadcast frequencies, so the government had an interest in making sure they served the public good. The doctrine never applied to newspapers, and courts have generally said it cannot be applied to cable news channels or the internet, and probably streaming, because there's plenty of space for everybody on those platforms. So let's talk about passing a variation of a new law, which I'll go back to Europe, but trying to pass a new updated version of the Fairness Doctrine would apply to today's media platforms like social media, cable, internet, and it would face a lot of constitutional hurdles. In the US, the government generally cannot tell publishers, broadcasters, online platforms what opinions they can or cannot publish. If the government tried to force a social media company, a news outlet, or a streaming service to be more balanced, the Supreme Court would likely strike it down as compelled speech, which violates the First Amendment. So, do you think there's any obvious way? Some people might say Section 230, which is the primary law.
Section 230 would apply to way more than just the Fairness Doctrine, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, that would apply to like basically all content on the internet.
Yes.
And that's like a whole other can of worms that deals with way more than just the Fairness Doctrine. And if we started talking about Section 230, we would have a 5-hour episode.
For the public that does not know, Section 230 is a law that protects internet platforms from being sued for what their users post on their platforms. And that allows tech companies to...
You can imagine, for the audience, you can imagine how internet for social media companies, internet companies being sued for the content that their users post. You can imagine how that would be a massive can of worms that people don't want to open.
Yes. And I think if we're not going to enact fines or something, I think personally, the Section 230 should be deemed... They have to be written in a way that if a user, or maybe not amended. Well, can I say this?
Yeah.
In 2018, you remember they passed an exception for platforms that facilitate sex trafficking, and that they were civil rights violations or cyber stalking. And what if they did something that under the new law that victims of a broadcast that negatively facilitates, I don't know how we would describe it, but
there would be a whole lot of lawsuits that would open up a bunch of lawsuits, but most of them would be dismissed for lack of standing because it'd be hard to find an actual injury because you.
But it would scare networks into imposing the Fairness Doctrine themselves because we would be allowing victims to sue the platform directly.
I think fines would be more. I think some level of structuring a fine, like a fine structure, like a fee, would be better than amending Section 230, because it's just hard to figure out how would they amend Section 230.
Well, I say if they're hosting it, they shouldn't be in trouble. But if they're amplifying it, either through their algorithm or by actually paying the person to be a broadcaster.
Yes, but that deals with algorithms. There's no third-party content being shown on. I mean, unless they show like a clip of an advertisement or a clip of somebody else's video, there's no third-party content being platformed by users of these news companies. All of the content that they platform is stuff that is their content. They're just reporting on the news. The only third-party content that would be on there is them showing a video or a clip of something else, like they show an advertisement and they want to talk about what the political advertisement meant. That's the problem with Section 230 and amending Section 230 to try to figure out how to get. I don't know if you can be creative with laws, but I don't know if you could be creative enough to actually make something that applies and is legal, right?
Yeah.
Because there's no third-party content being shown on these. It's their content. They're putting out the material that they want. It's not like somebody posts a video of a terrorist attack on a social media platform. That's different.
Yeah, in the U.S., First Amendment prohibits the government from regulating the content of expression. And then, obviously, most legislators would oppose the EU's approach as they think their content moderation is censorship. But if we were able to have large platforms being subjected to a FCC equivalent to an IRS audit as a mandatory annual audit that verifies they're complying to these content moderation commitments, or any very large online platform would be forced to proactively assess and mitigate the systematic risks their platform poses, such as the spread of hate speech, or
obviously you still face lawsuits in court. But I think that I'm like I said earlier, I'm much more. It would be much easier to defend in a lawsuit you enforcing agency rules that aren't necessarily violating the First Amendment. We're just enforcing rules.
What if you enact mandatory notice and action systems where U.S. companies that do things with that involve the First Amendment, either newspapers, journalism, newspapers, TV, streaming, social media, that they are required to maintain systems that users can report illegal content, and they are required to acknowledge every single one, legally be obligated to follow them up and to provide solutions. And if they don't, that will be countered or will be they will be monitored, and then they will be fined for failing to hold the responsibility of the platform's role, size, and impact in an online ecosystem.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see if we could argue that rule upholds the First Amendment, and then another wrinkle into that would be the regulation of cable news networks and private platforms compared to just public airwaves, because the scarcity of resources argument that was the big crux of Red Lion does not apply. To cable news networks. Does not apply to, and I would argue doesn't even apply to public news networks anymore, because the scarcity of airwaves isn't a problem anymore. But that's public news networks. You could argue they have a public duty, but cable news networks and social media platforms don't have that. Or you could at least argue that they don't. We could argue that they do, but I don't know how strong that is, because I think that courts are more likely to side with the private corporations, obviously because capitalism and because of corporate interest and whatever, but also just because I think in general they will always err on the side of not restricting the First Amendment when they can. And that's what makes a lot harder for us to do anything compared to Europe, because we have that right enshrined in our Constitution, and it's not like it's some law that we can just overturn.
Yeah, and I think one of the arguments we haven't addressed that is that too few companies control the media and tech industry. The government needs to use antitrust laws like the Sherman Act to break up these companies. Maybe doing what like the NBA does. Well, I think they've changed it now. It's up to 15%. But a media company can only own 5% of the local news channels in the entire national picture. Or Netflix can only own Netflix. Google would
that way you don't have Nexstar dominating entire markets.
Or Meta would have to sell Instagram, WhatsApp, or sell Facebook, or like Amazon would have to decide between Prime, their web services, or their store. And we're not talking about Standard Oil where they're just going to make it into a bunch of smaller companies. No, fully government will eminent domain that thing and find a buyer.
Yeah, it's like we are dividing assets up. You guys are separating, because like, yes, I think like
the destitution.
Large scale antitrust enforcement is really how this all starts. Realistically, let's be honest. Until
a court can force them to do that.
Yeah, until we do something about massive media conglomerates just constantly consolidating and buying each other. Like, for example, what's their faces? The CNN purchase that just went through.
Well, look at this.
Like Paramount and Warner Brothers Discovery.
Yep.
Like are merging, right? And that's horrible for the market, because now that means that CBS and CNN are now both controlled by Trump allies, right? And so it's like, and then you like, and then obviously Fox. Well, Fox, when they sold to Disney, they kept the news stations for themselves. But again, you have a few small companies that own a majority of cable TV and local TV stations. Until we do something about that, any of these laws that we might pass, even if they are able to be enforced, we're limited with what we can do. And that probably won't even happen anyway, because again, all these companies spend billions of dollars to lobby the government and to manipulate public opinion to be in their favor, because they control what we see on TV.
Yeah, and the thing is that they can block. I mean, obviously, this administration wouldn't do it, but like they could aggressively block mergers. They could, have companies, like we said, have the court make them divest, as well as the court could force companies to change how they do business. The government could ban self-prefacing, like legally stopping Apple from favoring its own apps instead of independent ones on your iPhone. Like, we're living in an era that needs antitrust action, like Gasho, the senator from Ohio, said that we need to inflict pain on these.
The Arizona guy.
Arizona, that we need to inflict pain on these companies that they would flinch at the idea of doing anything wrong. And last year, a federal judge ruled that Google illegally maintained a monopoly, and we don't know anything because the government was supposedly going to dole out a punishment, and that punishment should be forcing Google to sell off major parts of his business. And I mean, look,
at the end of the day, I forgot about that. Yeah, that was last year.
Yeah, what's going on?
Year. But I mean, obviously I think they appealed they're still appealing like the remedies, and also so I think the appeal's still going on, so I don't think anything has been settled yet in that case. But the thing is, if they actually wanted to, if we had government that was actually interested in antitrust enforcement, we could actually get some things done. But
dude, the DOJ actually
the Brandon administration was like probably the most aggressive antitrust administration in our lifetimes. And even then, they could only do so much because they never had the support. They didn't want to rock the boat. Their FTC regulations and rules were constantly being litigated by the courts, and then obviously all the rest of the stuff has been a lot of the stuff's been overturned anyway. And they could just never have this. They just never had the broad support of the government. So it's like the Brandon antitrust can only do so much.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy to think that we live in a world where we're living in a country where we don't have just the news.
Yep, we don't have control. We don't have control over what we see. We do not have control over any of the media that's in front of us. Like every place that we get our news from, pretty much every place we'll get our news from is coming from either somebody choosing what to broadcast on our television screens or from a manipulated social media algorithm.
Yep. And Reuters is what? A British company.
Yeah, Reuters is a British-based company.
And then the AP News, the only reason the AP is able to maintain as a non-profit is because their wire service is what pays the bills. It's not even their journalism. They offer a wire service, and this is similar to what Bloomberg is a tech company, and you could say the AP is sort of a tech company now. Bloomberg has their own wire service. Unlike for news, it's for like all financial things,
and they have other. So that's what they're making their money on, is services.
Yeah, it's the services, literally, and that is what they do. Right here, it's a web resource. It's like the best one out there, and it's like all your news comes, like the facts come from the AP through their wire, and that's like how it works.
It's like everything you see on those tweets where it's a random headline of an article, the headline of that article, that outlet, if it's not directly from the AP itself, that's where they got it from.
This is insane. And also the fact that a federal judge declined to issue an immediate order compelling the White House to reinstate access to presidential events for the AP. and instead encouraged the White House to do so, in his opinion. Following the decision, the White House said that covering the president was a privilege, not a legally enshrined right.
Yep, of course they did. Because this is the most This is one of the most anti-free speech administrations we've ever seen.
And then the United States Court of Appeals in D.C. Circuit imposed a stay upon the lower court's order, allowing the White House to resume barring access to media events.
Yep.
The AP.
Yep.
How is that allowed?
Because injunctions and stays are the Supreme Court itself. They basically, what was the one case that they did where they basically said nationwide injunctions? They did it recently. It was like last year. They've always looked very negatively upon nationwide injunctions. And so because the Supreme Court looks negatively upon them, other courts don't really have a choice but to kind of follow the Supreme Court's guidance, right? And so like that, like the court is just going to let things in place until really they actually probably shouldn't have stayed the order. I think that's probably wrong. I think that there's no Trump would not be harmed if the AP was allowed to cover him. Like, the whole point of an injunction is like you're going to be harmed if it doesn't happen, which I think is bullshit that a court even bought that to begin with. Let's be real here. I mean, come on, it's the fucking AP. The AP covering you while you're trying to ban them from covering you is not going to harm you, bro. But Trump did appoint a large section of the federal judiciary, so he kind of has a lot of them in his pocket right now.
Also, this McFadden guy is F this dude.
Which dude?
Like McFadden?
Oh yeah.
He's also part of a weird church called. It used to be called the Episcopal. What is it? Episcopal? Episcopal? What do you guys call those Gentiles?
Episcopalians? What is he? Some creepy?
Yeah, the Falls Church, Angelic. Well, they renamed their church, and if your church's been renamed, that's weird. They're now called the Falls Church Angelic Church of Falls Church, Virginia.
Falls Church Anglican. So he's an Anglican church. Okay, wait. So hold on. So what?
It used to be called
What's weird about this church? I can't say anything about this church that's weird. It's not like Amy Coney Barrett's group.
They're just a conservative.
It just seems like they're just an old school, like, conservative Episcopalian church. It doesn't really seem like there's like Amy Coney Barrett's like weird. She's in like a weird culty type thing.
So I guess
she's in like some weird culty thing.
Yeah, and the weird thing about this is, well, I knew she was in the culty thing. This is just like some old fashioned. What is Angelicanism? What's the difference between
Anglicanism?
Damn, dude, I'm so stupid.
That's just the Church of England.
I knew what Anglism is then. Yeah. So there's Episcopalians. Dude, why does both of those words not look like how they're pronounced?
Because
you know what I mean?
Because they're I don't know, probably something to do with the fact that English used to be a significantly different language before we adopted a bunch of the Latin alphabet. Maybe.
Okay.
But the Anglican Church is not that old. So
that's the one he made so he could divorce his wife, right?
So he could divorce, yes. So I'm really not too sure why it is the way it is. Because like it's not that old. Like by that point, English was basically the same language that it is now by the 1600s. We'd basically gotten all of we basically had our modern alphabet by then.
Mm-hmm.
Like we had our fully Latin alphabet. So it's like, I don't know, it's weird. Huh. I'm not sure why it is the way it is, but yeah. So that would be my guess, I guess. It's something old ass English and trying to modernize the spelling of words. There's probably some weirdness in there.
Yeah.
Because Old English is like a ridiculous language compared to modern English.
Yeah, definitely.